Good morning, everybody. Welcome to FSU Coach Live. My name is Tim Baghurst, joined with a special guest this morning, Nick Winkelman. Nick, thanks for joining me. If you wouldn't mind just telling a little bit of your history and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, Tim, it's an honor to be here. And I love that intro, by the way. Gets us speakers pumped up. Hopefully the listeners are pumped up as well. I'm a little bit farther into my day, so the coffee is well settled into my veins at this point. But again, appreciate you inviting me on.
Sure.
So my background is a little bit mixed, but by trade, I'm a strength conditioning coach. So I consider myself a coach first and foremost, and I've been doing that now for over 15 years. Like many, played high school football and cut my teeth in the coaching realm. Had a great high school strength coach named Rudy. If we think back to the Notre Dame film, he very much so was in the spirit of that. And so early on, I had a really positive experience with a coach that, let's say, understood the person as well as the player. So he sparked my interest in coaching. I nearly went on to Oregon State University, got an exercise science degree, met a wonderful mentor there named Guido van Rijsegem, who had come over from Belgium, self-taught, spent 15 years in professional baseball. And he introduced me to a gentleman named Mark Verstegen, who at the time owned a company called Athletes Performance, and now it's better known by its name, Exos. And so I never went on and interned there in 2006, went on to get hired and spent 10 years at Exos, overseeing kind of two different areas, which is one of the reasons I was excited to get on this call. One is as a strength coach working with players transitioning to the NFL via the NFL Combine. So I spent 7 of my 10 years running that program in Phoenix and methodologically for the whole country or for the whole company. But equal to that, I spent a lot of time doing coach education. So I was very fortunate to run our mentorship program, as we called it there, for the 10 years that I was at Exos. And then inevitably, I think like many coaches, once you feel that the value you can add is topped out, you want to go out and challenge yourself. And so moved my family in 2016 to Dublin, Ireland, where I now have the fortunate responsibility of overseeing athletic performance for Irish Rugby. And that involves working with both our national teams as well as our 4 professional teams that feed into that. So it's really interesting to be able to get both the national perspective as well as the professional perspective. And that brings us up to where we are today, 4 years later.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote, because obviously that is what interested me in you. Doing your webinar and learning everything that's in your content, your dissertation. I want to get to that in a little bit, but I find it interesting that here you are, director of performance in rugby. And
Yes.
Is it a sport that you have a lot of experience in as a player or coach?
So I've had zero experience as a coach, zero experience as a player. And so a little bit of the background, because I get the question over here all the time. How did a guy go from American football to rugby? We've seen a lot of people be imported from a sports science perspective from Europe and Australia into US sports, but we're not seeing a lot go the other way. And so I guess I'm one person going a little bit against the grain. So a little bit of context is I've been fortunate through, as I said earlier, the Exos mentorship program to present training methodology all around the world multiple times over. And in doing that, you're fortunate to get exposed to many different sports and many different sport coaches. And naturally, I think rugby strength coaches like to talk to American football strength coaches and vice versa. So very much so, I was familiar with the sport in my travels. I wasn't naive to it. And in fact, I even started to integrate rugby examples when I was presenting, let's say, for example, in the UK or in Australia, because they resonated far more than my American football ones. At the same time, I was fortunate to get a degree, albeit a remote MSc, but it had a 2-week practicum from Edith Cowan University, which is in Perth, Australia. And while I was there, I got to meet a ton of coaches from AFL, Rugby League, and Rugby Union. And from a networking perspective, we stayed in contact. And so in 2015, Irish Rugby had just exited the World Cup. My now boss, David Nusafora, was looking for, let's say, a fresh voice or a slightly different perspective on athletic performance. And we have a mutual friend of which we're both close with. We said, well, give this guy a call, see what you think. And it was one of those things that was natural from the beginning, hand in glove. What he was looking for mirrored my background. and we both agreed that the least of our concerns was the fact that I had never played or coached in rugby. That was going to be the easiest thing to learn. And 4 years later, I think he made a good decision. I think I made a good decision.
Mhm. One of the interesting themes across a lot of these interviews is the importance of networking, of getting yourself out there, of being available and communicating. And it sounds like this is a great example. You didn't come through a traditional sport um, in rugby, yet you have those connections and people know what you're valued for. If you wouldn't mind, though, tell us a little bit about what you're, other than the podcast that you're doing over the past couple of weeks with your book. What does your typical day look like? What do you do as a performance director?
Well, do you want to know pre-COVID or post-COVID, or maybe a bit of both?
Because hopefully post-COVID won't last for too long.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I was gonna say if it's current, that's a short one. It's Zoom call after Zoom call.
Yeah.
But pre-COVID, it's really interesting. As I noted there, I have the fortunate responsibility of working across national and provincial teams. So I think to partly answer the questions, to give you a little bit of context on what that looks like. So we have a men's and women's national team for the 15s.
Mm-hmm.
We have a men's and women's national team for the 7s. And then we have our representative squad, so under 20s. Those are just the national teams. And then we have 4 professional teams: Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and Ulster. And like most European sports, there's a domestic league, and then there's a European league. And all 4 of our teams play in both, which means they're on the upper echelon of rugby, let's say, talent and ability from a squad perspective, which is fantastic for Ireland because we're a small nation. We only have so many players in the pipeline. So it's great to have all of our players exposed to such a high level of competition. My responsibility is to work, advise, lead, and direct, let's say, the athletic performance strategy across all of those entities. And what I like to explain to people is we have heads of athletic performance for each of those teams.
Okay.
So I'm not directly managing any one of those teams or any one of the coaches on it. I just work across all of our heads to make sure that what we're doing is aligned. So that's the technology we're using, the systems we're using, the processes we use around monitoring, around GPS, around professional development. And so I like to describe it as we are a community of competitors, because at the end of the day, these 4 teams play against each other. But what's interesting about rugby is you have to play in the country to play for the country. So a big part of driving players to play for their home teams is that we put a lot into players' safety, welfare, and performance, a lot. And so my role, along with my nutrition and medical colleagues, is to make sure that we are bringing continuity and consistency across how we develop the player physically and mentally, knowing that ultimately it's our head coaches and our rugby coaches, it's their job to set the technical, tactical agenda, which is most certainly different across the 4 teams and different still across the national team. And so when I started, there was good communication, but fast forward now, we have a leadership call that every 2 weeks has every head of athletic performance nationally and provincially on one call. And even though these individuals compete with one another, we talk about this idea of power of 4, and that we have 4 provinces. So every time I as one share, guess what? There are 3 things coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've created this unbelievable community feel. So a lot of my time then is spent facilitating these meetings. I spend time in every province every month. So that's getting on the road. It's only 2 hours down the road for 3 of them. I live across the street from the other one. And then luckily now for us, Tim, we've built our first high performance center. So finally now my office is out of an office building. It's back in a gym where I feel at home. And that allows me to work with our 7s program and our heads there day in, day out. So really, is there a blueprint to my day? Absolutely not. I'm fortunate to spend 70% of my time in the crow's nest, looking far ahead, and 30% on the deck. It's opposite for all the people I work with. Together, we're able to steer the ship in the right direction.
I would wonder then, as a high performance director, whether you feel the pressure of always having to know what that next thing is, what we're missing out on, what we should be doing. Do you experience that? What are some of the challenges you do face?
I wouldn't say I feel that pressure explicitly,
Okay.
Maybe that's because I stay in front of that pressure, and the pressure I put on myself always exceeds
Right.
that possibly could be coming from superiors. But when I came in, my remit or job description, as we'd say stateside, was very clear. It was to build an integrated sports science system that brought continuity and consistency across every single player. And so that means if data is collected, down in the south in Munster, the west in Galway, up north in Ulster, or where we are in the east in Leinster, that we would be able to start to bring that in centrally across various forms of data and tell one story about our players. And so there's a lot to do with that. You have to get the right technology. You have to have the right software. You have to have the right data streams to bring it to and fro. You have to have data scientists that know how to make sense of it, because most certainly that's not my bag. Mathematics, I was average all the way through. So very much so, I've taken a coach's approach to this. I'm a facilitator. I at no point need to be the expert in all the areas. I need to find the right expertise and point it. And so that's what I've really enjoyed about my position, is being able to work with people across the whole country to identify and synthesize best practices. And then just with my job, use best practice at scale. And I have the time to be able to do that with the negotiations for the right technology company, the negotiation for the right hire, so on and so forth. And all that wraps under the bucket of, I'd say, process. My real passion is in people. My PhD was in fundamentally the impact of communication on learning to move. So I'm a humanist in terms of my actual interest, which is so funny because so much of my job is in sports science. But I'm a big believer that if we get the sports science right, we can focus more on the person at the end of the day versus the numbers that person generates. And so the biggest thing that I'm proud of is I'm proud of our people, but I'm proud of our professional development approach. We've built national standards for professional development in the same way we have technology. And so we believe strongly that professional development is player development. If we can create a coaching environment that allows people to grow, to be challenged safely, and to thrive, ultimately the net echo of that is a better experience for our players. And so that's where I spend the vast majority of my time, is working with our coaches individually and collectively to develop a strong culture of professional development.
Well, if you're just joining us, just a reminder, we're talking to Nick Winkelman. He's the author of The Language of Coaching, and I want to transition to that as well. But if you do have questions about what Nick does with rugby and some of the contents of the book, please do post them in your chat box and we'll get them to him. So here's your book. It's called The Language of Coaching, The Art and Science of Teaching Movement. And I'm still waiting for my copy, but I did go through your webinar, and thanks COVID for allowing me the opportunity to do my own professional development. I was really interested in this because it was part of your dissertation, and it's something that coaches maybe talk about but don't really think about, right?
Yeah,
the coaching it's about the X's and O's, and I care about my players, et cetera, but how do you actually coach? And so you provide some good instruction in there. Talk a little bit about how you got interested in and actually how you communicate as coaches.
Yeah, it's a very roundabout way. I guess, everybody has a natural affinity towards certain things. And if you expose yourself to enough things in life, you'll figure out what really drives you, what wakes you up in the morning and keeps you up at night. And so I would say my first interaction that suggested that this might be a path I want to go down is I was working as a personal trainer. In fact, I was being trained to be a personal trainer in college, trying to make some money on the side, but knowing that I wanted to go into strength conditioning, I thought it was a good first step. And I worked with a gentleman named JC, and in watching him coach, I was just always admired how he communicated. He communicated with such intensity, maybe sometimes too much intensity, but precision. And it's as if his clients' minds orbited around his every word. He captivated his clients and their attention, which obviously is helpful if you want them to think about what you're saying. But also when they get done with a set of the bench press or a shoulder press or a squat, it was like his language, his cues, the way he encouraged them to focus while they moved was almost a superpower, a super talent on his end. But to be honest with you, Tim, he had never talked about it. And it wasn't like, we talked about program design all the time, reps and sets, X's and O's. But his real power was how he communicated. And when I compared him to other coaches I had experienced firsthand or observed, he just was very different. And I went to another coach at the time and I said, listen, there's something here. And one day I think I want to write a book called The Form Within. And so I was 20. I was 19 or 20 when I had that experience. Now, as I say in the book, before you can think about how to coach, you need to know what to coach. So, Tim, let's be honest. It makes sense that many coaches are enamored with X's and O's, drills, programming, periodization, biomechanics. Because if you don't have those fundamentals, even if you study how to coach, you might be coaching the wrong thing. And so it makes sense that the foundation, and let's say maybe the gap that we're looking at is the gap. Because if the gap was in program design and biomechanics and knowing how people move, well, then we'd have a big problem. Okay, so this is, I just think, the natural evolution of coaching and coaching science. So fast forward then 2009, I had, let's say, accumulated enough what? I was confident in my own skin as a coach, confident in my programming. I could defend it. I could get on a stage and give a presentation on it. I felt very good there. And so 2009 was an important year for me. I talk about it in the book. It was the catalyst for a lot of this. It was the first year I ran the NFL Combine Development Program at Exos. So I had 30 players from across the country who were already top draft prospects. And my job was simply to make sure they went to the NFL Combine and didn't make a fool of themselves. That they went in and, as best they can, answer these physical questions to the best of their ability, knowing that it's only part of the draft story. And so I took this responsibility seriously because the predecessors who had run the program before me had all gone to the NFL or the NBA. The program I was running, I wasn't the one that wrote it. And so I was very focused on making sure that the I's were dotted, the T's were crossed, and I was coaching with immense detail. The problem is, it dawned on me, and this was a January morning on a Monday. I was coaching. And Tim, had you been there watching me coach, I think you probably would have thought it was a pretty good session. I was communicating clearly before, during, after. Everything was with surgical detail, time precision. All the exercises were locked on board. But I quickly realized, I don't know why it hit me in that moment, but it did, that in my mind, I was with the program. I was regurgitating my boxed cues on what the knee should be doing, the hips should be doing. I was executing, and I was just on a loudspeaker. So it's like I had hit play in my mind. I wasn't fully present. I wasn't looking to see the echo of my impact, of my words on the way they moved. I was a one-way street. And in the moment, it hit me. I'm like, how could they possibly think about the 3 cues I just rattled off? Let alone, how could they possibly think about them while they're already moving? And what happens if one cue works well for that person over there, but a different cue is better for that other one? And by the way, all of them have different biomechanical needs. So why am I communicating as if they all have the same problem? And so just this flood of awareness hit me. And it probably hit me more emotionally than it did intellectually. It took me time to unpack it. But inevitably, I parked it, but it was like an itch that I could not scratch throughout the remainder of that 2009 Combine period. We then get to the NFL Combine in Indianapolis, Lucas Oil Stadium. We have a wonderful training facility about 200 yards away where we train the guys up. And so, of course, my guys are running, they're jumping, and next to me I have my computer looking at the results we achieved in Phoenix and the video and all that good stuff. And I'll never forget how disappointed I was at the end of it. Not because of the results per se, because if we look at the average improvement of our guys, it was on par with what we had done in prior years. So it's like the program had done its job. It worked. But that's the point, Tim. The program worked. I didn't. You do anything long enough, you do enough sprints, you sprint for a far enough distance, you lift enough weight, you will adapt. You will change by the very nature of stress, adaptation, and specificity. But obviously, Tim, if there's a coach, the coach is meant to add something extra.
Right.
The coach is meant to do something that the program by itself cannot do. And in my mind, what is that? I analogize it to the car and the driver. I believe the program is meant to upgrade the car. If we have a good program, they will get bigger, faster, stronger by the pure nature of doing the work. But there's nothing in the human body that really says, I need to optimize movement at the highest level. No, the body operates on a good enough principle, but sport operates on the best principle. And so if coaches are negotiators, we're trying to negotiate with our athletes' movement patterns to get them to such a superior level, well beyond the level that survival would normally demand. And so I look at the coach as being the arbiter of the driver. We teach the person how to move the car better. That's patterning, skills, coordination, so on and so forth. And obviously the coach writes the program as well. But we're looking at the coach as the arbiter of movement here. And what I realized was this. When I was there cueing, when I was there reminding, they could the person that rounded their back could get up straight. The person that reached too far in front of them could drive down from a sprinting perspective. But obviously, when you removed me, put the stress of television and the interview questions on them, that many of them reverted back to their technical type. And how many coaches have dealt with that again and again and again? Right. They look great on Tuesday in practice, but it all falls apart on Saturday. This is the burden. This is the demise of so many coaches. And so I wasn't facing anything unique. But I think what was unique is I think I figured out why I was facing it. And that was, it wasn't a failure of the program. It was the failure of how I coached it. If learning is about them owning the change, you have not taught until they have learned. They had not owned the change, Tim. And that sent me on a long mission. And the first place I began was the impact of our words on their movement. And inevitably that blossomed into all corners of motor learning.
Two of the things that you've talked about, at least in your webinar, and again, I'm looking forward to reading it in your book as well, is the focus. We need to focus more on external cues rather than internal cues. And a lot of coaches are taught angles and body positions and those kinds of things. And then also we need to tie it into what they know and understand. And I think a lot of coaches forget that in the respect that, many years ago when I was a student, I was working with a physical education teacher, and she talked about how she used to teach kids to hit balloons, right? And use different parts of your body to hit the balloon. And she said, I want you to hit the balloons with your elbows. And so all of a sudden these kids are trying to hit it with their elbows, and they can't do it. They can't figure it out. And so she said, stop. She said, I want you to imagine walking around like a chicken. How does a chicken walk? And so suddenly they start doing this. And she said, okay, I want you to hit the balloon like a chicken would. And all of a sudden they start bringing up their elbows. And it was a good reminder that we need to provide coaching in a format that our athletes understand who they are, understand what makes them work, and then put it in that kind of position. And that's something that you really highlighted or are highlighting.
Yeah, for sure. Julian Treasure, who has 5 different TED Talks on communication, says something that resonates with me, and that is, to be understood, you must first understand. And at the end of the day, what we have to remember is every time we communicate from our position of understanding. We use the stories that make sense to us. We use the words and the phrases that make sense to us. We use the anecdotes and pop culture references that make sense to us. And that's okay. Nobody can fault you, nor should they, from communicating from that position. However, I think great coaches quickly realize that if they don't move off that position, if they don't seek to understand the person behind the player, that they're only going to be able to move that relationship so far and the understanding that they can engender in that person so far. And so as I started to realize that, it simply triggered a very simple habit of asking my athletes more questions, listening to their answers more intently, and ultimately trying to collect their words, collect their ideas, collect their lived experience, their generational pop culture, and weave that into the way I communicate, because the meaning can be maintained, but what I wrap that meaning with, i.e. the words, is different. So it's such that the cargo did not change, but just the train that drove the cargo did. And so that's the key thing we have to remember as coaches. What we're trying to get across is not our words. We're trying to get across the meaning of those words. So we should not be attached to our words and our stories. We should be attached to meaning and finding the best mechanism to bridge that meaning from our brain into theirs. And so that is a general statement. I think you can cash that check at about any coaching bank on offer. Specifically, though, back to the first part of your question, where does this whole idea of internal and external cueing come in? And how does it maybe match or map to your ability to better connect with athletes of all ages, skill levels, and sport types? Well, like most coaches, when I started, my cues, the communication I used to nudge movement, was all over the place. Sometimes I'd use analogies like the example you gave on the chicken wing. Sometimes I'd be very biomechanically driven, saying extend your hip, dorsiflex, push off your big toe, and everything in between. And when I first started as a coach, I didn't know that there was classifications of cues. It didn't even dawn on me to think about the different type of language one might use to impact the way another moves. I always knew communication was important, but it was only when I found Dr. Gabrielle Wolf, last name spelled W-U-L-F, who's at UNLV. She's really, some people call me the king of cues. Well, I call her the queen of cues because she wrote the first paper back in 1998. And now fast forward, we're looking at easily 170 papers that have examined the difference between using internal cues or internal language to promote how someone thinks while they move versus external cues or external language to promote how we think while we move. So to give the listeners a quick definition, internal cues relate to the movement process and specifically mean that your language is highlighting joint motion or muscle activation, something to do with the body. Whereas external cues relate more to movement outcomes, such that we might talk about pushing off the ground, jumping as high as we can, bench press, driving the barbell away from the bench, driving the barbell towards the ceiling, so on and so forth. And I think if you ask most coaches to scan their communication for cues that fall across that continuum, they're going to say, yep, my cues fall in both areas. They both are important. And they probably say, it depends on when I'm going to use them. And I was that exact coach, Tim. But what we come to find out is that it doesn't depend as much as we think. That when it comes to the things we focus on while we move, and I'm going to be very precise with what I'm saying here. When it comes to things we focus on while we move, the evidence, and I even think the person's own experience is very clear, that you are more than likely, if we compare internal to external, to move better right now, but learn to move right now in a way that allows you to retain it without further reminder later. Far better with an external cue or an analogy, as the example you gave highlights, than if we just use any internal language. And so let's take a bench press, for example. I could give you the cue, extend your elbow. I could give you the cue, squeeze your pec. Both of those would be internal. What those highlight is it summarizes for the athlete or the client the bench press to just the elbow or the bench press to just the pec. But I think we could ask anyone listening, is the bench press only involve the elbow or only involve the pec? And the answer unequivocally is no. Okay, it involves multiple joints. Okay, then why are we asking them to highlight just that one segment of the movement as the dominant focus when the movement, in fact, is more complex and multi-joint? And I think when people get their intuitions going, they're like, well, they still can perform the movement and focus on that joint. I'm like, yes, they can, and they will. And it's not that people don't get better with internal cues. It's just that they get far better with external. Why is that? Well, we've wrongly assumed, and this is in part a failure of omission. We've wrongly assumed that because our biomechanical books say movement looks like this and describes it as such. And our kinesiology book says movement works like that and described it as such. Because that was the only resource we were given as coaches that actually described movement, we inadvertently adopted that as our language to coach movement. But when I tell you to extend your elbow, that is not giving you an indication of how to perform the complex movement of the bench press. That's just highlighting one feature of the bench press. Like me saying, well, that's the brakes on the car, assuming that that helps the person know how to use the brakes.
Right.
No, that is not. When I say that you need to extend your elbow, I am increasing your knowledge of the movement, possibly reducing your uncertainty associated with the movement, reducing anxiety, and preparing you to mentally accept, okay, now the information that might help you perform it. Too often we just use descriptive language and assume that we are also within that descriptive language helping the person understand how to perform it. And I think that's a fallacy that we need to move beyond. And that's where external cues come in. I can tell you to drive the bar towards the ceiling. I can tell you to drive the bar away from the bench. Let's say my elbows are casting down a little bit. I can say, I want you to imagine that there is a brick wall just in front of the plates on the bar. Roll the bar up the wall. Don't hit the wall, roll it up the wall. And so I can start taking the immensity that is the human mind and start creating visualized constraints in the environment that if they were there, it would fundamentally change the movement in the same way I intend to change it by talking about the muscle itself or talking about the joint itself. And in doing so, though, it creates a simple phrase, hides technique in something visual that can easily ride along as I perform the movement. And as movements become more complex, Tim, and as movements become faster, this whole shift from internal to external becomes that much more important because our ability to attend to multiple things is going to get narrower and narrower as complexity and speed increases. Now, as a final anecdote, people hear that and say, are you telling me I need to remove all internal language from the way I coach? And you've seen the webinar and you know the answer to that is unequivocally no. Internal cues need to be neighbors of your external cue, but you always want an external cue to be a partition, to be the space between the mind of the athlete and when they move. So I can describe, hey, bench press, extend the elbow, squeeze the pec. This is what I need you to do. Now I take a deep breath. To do that, I want you to focus on driving the bar through the ceiling. What I've done now is I've upgraded your knowledge of the what, and I've given you an insight into the how. I've put in the right address to the GPS signal. And the final thing to tickle the intuition of the listener, if all we needed was internal language, if all we needed was knowledge of movement and movement quality and biomechanics to be the best movers, then coaches would be the best movers. And most certainly, I'm not going to speak for you, Tim. I don't think that's the case. So with that in mind, our children didn't need internal cues to learn to walk, run, throw a ball, or bike. I'm going to challenge that your experts need it.
Yeah, and it's reminiscent of the inner game of tennis, which I'm sure some people may have read who are watching, and I know I've read, and you know, teaching racket sports myself, I kind of, this starts to make sense, right? We tend to focus on these internal cues, and it breaks down our ability to do our job. The one thing I would say as well is in your conversation, you talked about being at the combine, and these athletes are doing all these things well, and then they go to the combine, and maybe they do things well, but not as well as perhaps they should. In part, that could be because they're trying to break down the internal cues rather than I'm a cheetah kind of attitude and just going for it. This is something that I think a lot of coaches forget. They tend to, you know what, things aren't going well, let's start breaking it down rather than, how do I help the athlete understand how to do this? And then we start to do this great analysis of the technique, and then they get all confused and their technique gets worse because they don't know what to do anymore. And too often, maybe too many cues, too many situations, too many thoughts going through that brain. And then all of this automaticity starts to break down.
Well said, Tim. I mean, we're just in each moment, despite our positive intentions of wanting to share as much knowledge and do as much good as we can, we inadvertently cause damage when we give more than one cue before someone moves. Because if I give more than one cue, as you said there, I'm asking them to multitask. I'm asking them to flip between two things. Now, in part, it depends on the skill. If I'm performing a 100-meter dash, I can have multiple cues that relate to the phase of the movement, right? Because I can think about something during the start. I can think about something driving me through the accelerative phase, maybe something in transition, and something to finish the race. That's perfectly fine. But it's when we have complex movements, as you said, they're racket sports, baseball, throwing type sports, where now I'm giving you 2 or 3 things to think about. How can a baseball player, like, just think about this yourself if you're listening in. How can you feasibly entertain 3 different biomechanical cues simultaneously while paying attention to the pitch release and swinging a baseball bat?
Right.
Like, it is virtually impossible. We don't need any science on external and internal cueing. Just go right to the attentional focus and attention research. We know that is impossible. And so if you give them 3 cues, what you're saying is either you're just trying to upgrade their knowledge, or feasibly you just want them to pick one, guess, or possibly, like many athletes, get frustrated and abandon the whole enterprise and just do what they want anyway, which we know some players are good despite their coaches, not because of it. And probably that has something to do with what we are talking about right now. And so from a coaching perspective, my big advice is very simple. Can you get to that one thing? And can you make that one thing simple, accessible, and promoting the technical change and service of performing the whole movement? And many coaches can't get off this position that I have to name the error and they have to think about the error to change the error. But I'm going to argue that there's infinite ways to communicate nuanced, subtle technical change without highlighting the technical change. You gave a perfect example with the chicken wing, in that if I put a visual in your mind where move as if, whereby moving as if forces me to have more hip extension, less hip extension, more movement side to side, more rotation, whatever it might be. It's the coach's job to own the technical nuance and then figure out how to put that into simple terms that the body can download into movement. And that takes effort. And in the book, Tim, I do my best to provide, it's not a formula. Let me be very clear. There is no one way to cue. The best cue is the one that works. Okay, so there is no one way to cue. But is there an anatomy of cues? Is there an anatomy of an analogy? Most certainly there is. So someone on a call the other day called my book a blueprint, and I like that. It's a blueprint with a little bit of pick your own adventure mixed in. But the biggest thing is it's a blueprint, but it's a behavior, Tim. You just said it at the very beginning of the call, and I loved how you phrased it. This is something that we do all the time, but we spend very little time thinking about. And just to put another intuition tickler out there, if I was to ask everyone listening in, would you rather present on your program, the physical what of what you do, to 100 of your closest peers? Would you rather present on the program or the intricacies of how you coach it? I'm going to put my money that the percentage is going to be far higher on coaching the program than on how they coach it. But at the same time, we spend more time coaching than we do programming. So where's the logic in that? And so for me, I have felt an utter responsibility to prove this information in my own world as an in the trenches coach, but then take an academic discipline to studying the literature to be authentic to first principles and merge it together and translate it into a package that every coach can understand. Because there's too many 4 and 8 syllable words in motor learning books. And the reality is most coaches can't get through it. So this book actually is almost in the spirit of the inner game of tennis. I profile the inner game of tennis, Timothy Galway, in the book for that reason. I'm hoping this is a 2020 version of his book, but building on it, giving people the blueprint to do what he so eloquently talked about.
Looking back over your career, just to kind of close out, the things that you've learned and the experiences you have and the leadership positions you now are involved in. What kind of recommendations do you have for coaches who may be entering the profession or, trying to move up or improve their skills?
It's such a good question. It's an important question. I'm a big believer in trying to identify skills and behaviors that give back. And by that, I mean give back to you as a coach. So that if you go into a situation, i.e. coaching an athlete, and you don't know everything about that athlete, you might not even know everything about the skill you're teaching. And if you're a young coach, most certainly that's the case. That's why you go to the clinic to learn more from the coaching elder who's done it before you. So what's a skill for that person, and a skill that still serves them when they become the coaching elder? And for me, it comes in the simple form of self-reflection and reflective feedback. And so are you creating an inner, not an outer, but an inner culture of reflective practice? Day in, day out, do you end each moment, each session with just a deep breath and a point of reflection? And some people like to go to pen to paper on this. Some people like to make it more rigorous. I'm sure in your coaching courses, you teach coaching analysis. But the reality is, to make it scalable, it just needs to be that moment of reflection. And I think as you become a better coach, you learn what to reflect on. And I think many people will reflect on the tangible pieces. Did they run faster? Did they not? Did they cover enough GPS meterage? Did they not? Did that exercise that I started with, did that seem to work well? Did it not? Did the session organizationally run well? And these are great things to reflect on, especially for a young coach still trying to sort out the what, as we said earlier. But I would challenge every coach, once you've figured out that reflective practice is key, especially as you get older and gain years in your career, are you equal, if not more, in your reflection of the how? What did I say? When did I say it? How did I say it? Why did I say it? Was it well received? Did I get eye contact and body language that suggested they were listening, that they understood? And then most importantly, did the cue, did the focus, did the intention I encourage, did it echo through their body? Did it echo through their movement? Did it make a difference? Or was I communicating down a one-way street? And so if I can be self-reflective in each moment as a coach, and at the end of a session, therein lies all the data, all the information you need to get 1% better. If you fear the reality of where you're at, you'll never get where you want to go. And self-reflection, reflective practice, requires vulnerability and honesty, in which I think you gain strength, because only then will you be able to put one foot in front of the other and become one of those elders that people one day look up to.
And also, I think the challenge is carving out time as a coach, where we're so busy doing this, that, and that, and we've got this thing to read and that thing to do. It's important to maybe schedule a little bit of time in the day just to pause and reflect on the work that you're doing and how you're doing it and how you can get better. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. If people want to get in touch with you, I've got your Twitter handle here. Is that a good way?
That's a great way. I think the website, thelanguageofcoaching.com, I'll be doing a lot of webinars like this, all open source, free. Otherwise, the tidbits day in, day out is at Nick Winkelman on Instagram and Twitter. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time and perspective, and really valuable information. And I think it's something that will be embedded in my classes for sure.
Beautiful.
I know our coaches really need to know about this information as well. Just a reminder, coming up next week, my bad, wrong button. Coming up next week, it happens to the best of us, right? Drew Watson is joining us on Monday. He's the director of athletics at Southeastern University, and we have a full schedule as well. He'll be joining us on Monday. Micah Kurtz on Tuesday. He's with the Windermere Prep. He's the director of sports performance and also an assistant AD. On Wednesday, Michael Holzer will come in. as assistant coach in men's soccer. Jason Hawkins is the general manager of OKC Energy, a soccer team. So that'll be really interesting to talk about how he manages an entire organization. And then we round it out with Kyle Stevenson, who's the head coach for track and field at Georgia State. So my thanks to Nick for joining me today, and hope you've enjoyed the production. But for now, thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Tim.